Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 19. This chapter deals with the Trans-Missouri West area and considers, did we treat the American West as though it were another colony? Before we get started, I want to take just a minute. Someone asked me about a recent video where you can see kind of the background. This is kind of the kid cave at my house with all the posters and everything, but you see over here this thing at the back. So I want to show you what it is. It's a bobcat, a taxidermy bobcat with skunk pelt over it, wearing orange and black ears from a Halloween costume. Anyway, I don't get it, but my kid loves taxidermy. So sorry you see a bobcat behind in the video. Alrighty, let's get started talking about Chapter 19. So what is and what was the West in America? Were there consistent themes and issues throughout the relationship between the West and the rest of the United States? And if so, what exactly were they? There were actually a number of West in American history, starting with the colonies when the country was settled. Anytime they moved a little further west, then that's considered a move to the West. So what we usually think about as the American West is really the last West. And it took place along the Pacific coast and in the Great Plains, the mountains, and the deserts, the desert areas, starting with the Pacific coast because it just made sense to settle along the coastal area where water was widely available. Most citizens looked at the West as a region to be settled by Americans and people of European descent, and they exploited it for the agriculture, the timber, and the mineral resources. The government sought to help this process. In 1862, the Homestead Act gave certain 160-acre plots of land to settlers who were willing to improve the land, but most of the good land was either sold or given to railroad companies and state governments. Very little was actually given to farmers to cultivate. The land there suffered as a consequence, and so did the Native Americans who actually inhabited the West. Some of these people, especially the 5 civilized tribes, have been pushed to the Great Plains earlier in the century with promises that their new lands would be theirs forever. And they shared the plains with other tribes of a nomadic existence, a life that depended on hunting buffalo, and then they used the buffalo not just for food, but for clothing, and they also used for building supplies. The Pueblo people occupied the desert Southwest, usually building stone and adobe structures near one of the few rivers in their area. And other tribes inhabited the Great Basin region and other interior regions of California, while still others lived in lush forest that bordered the Pacific Ocean. So given these cultural differences between whites and Indians, Native Americans, not Indians, especially over land ownership and use, the conflict was inevitable. After the Civil War, the federal government tried variations of the same basic policy. First, the government would persuade some members of a tribe to sign a treaty confining the tribe to a reservation. The government was supposed to provide food and supplies, and maybe even farming implements, and that most often did not happen. Violence, including senseless massacres, erupted when Native Americans didn't want to do what the whites wanted them to do. By the 1890s, American Indians, or Native Americans, had been pacified. The government set out to destroy the Native culture by forcing the Native Americans to speak English and to become Christians. It was not until the passage of the Wheeler-Howard Act of 1934 that these Native Americans officially gained their rights back to practice their native traditions and their culture. Mining was a major activity in the West, first in California. We know about the California gold rush. Then elsewhere it spread. So individual prospectors arrived at a strike first, and they'd take all the surface gold that they could. You know, you see images of people panning for gold. So they would take all the gold that they could from the surface like that. And then big business would set up because if there's gold on the surface, there's gold in the ground. So that's where the mining operations came in. And boom towns were created seemingly overnight in some cases from first the skimming of the surface layer gold and then the mining that came later. Then when the gold was gone, the towns were gone. Sometimes they'd leave ghost towns behind. Cattle industry also became big. It was especially big in the Great Plains area where there's a lot of grass. For several years, the long drives or the cattle drives saw cowboys drive their large herds several hundred miles north just to get them to railroad terminals so that they could ship beef, actually cows, they're shipping cattle, by railroad to markets back east. Cattle ranches expanded, and often with the liberal use of government land. Now, sometimes they would get these parcels from the Homestead Act, but that wasn't nearly enough land to feed a decent-sized herd of cattle. So they wandered through public open land, and the cows grazed, which caused problems because if everyone did that, eventually all the grass is gone, right? So there's nothing to feed the cows anymore. Farmers also settled in the West. Those on the West Coast typically did well, but the Great Plains farmers had to deal with a lot of different problems like insufficient rainfall, invasions of insects, and declining prices also became a problem. Farmers organized organizations for self-help and cooperative action, such as granges. We'll talk about the grangers in this chapter. And then they later organized other alliances that also engaged in self-help activities like co-ops that also entered politics to lobby on behalf of farmers. So I hope you find something you enjoy about chapter 19.